The Manhattan skyline pressed against the windows of Adrian Cole's office on the 42nd floor, like a reminder of how thin the veneer of reality actually was. From this height, the city looked almost abstract, geometric shapes of glass and steel, streams of cars flowing with the predictability of blood through veins, millions of lives reduced to patterns visible only from a distance. Adrian found himself staring at it more than working lately, a habit his therapist had noted with clinical concern during their last session. But therapists were, by profession, concerned with everything. He was 43 years old, still handsome in that way, intelligent men sometimes managed, despite neglecting themselves, with dark circles under his eyes that suggested he'd been reading neural imaging data until 3 in the morning again. The office was cluttered with research papers, coffee cups in various stages of staleness, and a whiteboard covered in theoretical models that probably made sense at the time he'd written them, but now looked like the desperate scrawls of a man grasping at invisible threads. The phone call came at 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, which later would seem significant despite being random. It was Dr. Helen Vasquez, a colleague from Johns Hopkins, and her voice carried the particular tone of someone about to propose something professionally dangerous. "Adrian, I need you to listen without immediately dismissing this," she began, which was precisely the kind of opening that made him lean back in his chair. "We've been tracking something, anomalous reports. They started appearing in psychiatric databases about 8 months ago, scattered across different states, different demographics, no obvious connection. But the descriptions are identical, the same details, the same language, the same conviction that what they experienced was real." "What kind of descriptions?" Adrian asked, already making notes. "People reporting that they've experienced alternate versions of themselves, that they remember living different lives, that their memories seem to have been edited, like someone went through their consciousness with a find and replace function. One patient in Boston claims she clearly remembers graduating from Yale, but her entire official record shows she went to Columbia. She has memories of Yale, detailed, sensory, emotional, but no evidence of Yale exists in her life." Adrian felt something shift in his chest, a kind of vibration that occurred whenever his rational mind encountered something that refused to be rationalized. "Confabulation," he said automatically. "False memory syndrome. The brain is extraordinarily good at creating coherent narratives from incomplete data." "That's what we thought," Helen said. "That's what makes this interesting. We ran every diagnostic. These aren't confused elderly patients or individuals with documented memory disorders. We're talking about neuroscientists, accountants, teachers, people whose brains are objectively functioning at high levels. And they're all reporting the same core phenomenon, the sensation of remembering something that never happened to them." "How many?" Adrian asked. 47 documented cases, but that's just the ones who sought psychiatric evaluation. The internet chatter suggests hundreds, maybe thousands, who are experiencing similar phenomena but haven't reported it officially." Adrian stood and walked to the window, the phone pressed against his ear. Below, the city continued its mechanical existence, indifferent to questions about the nature of consciousness or the reliability of experience. "Why are you calling me?" "Because you spent 7 years studying the neurobiology of false memory before your last publication basically disappeared from circulation. Because you were investigating something in that research that scared people in the department, specifically whether the brain could be deliberately manipulated to create false memories on a neural level. And because whatever is happening, it's accelerating." There it was. The thing Adrian had spent 3 years trying to bury after the incident with his graduate student, after the Ethics Review Board had decided that some lines, once crossed, couldn't be uncrossed. After the young woman, Sarah, her name was Sarah, had walked into his office and asked him to stop, and he'd realized that the experiment had progressed further than anyone officially knew. "I can't do this," Adrian said, and meant it. "I wouldn't ask if I had another option," Helen replied. but you're the only person I trust who understands both the science and the ethical implications of what might be happening here. If someone, or something, is deliberately manipulating consciousness on a population level, we need to understand the mechanism, and we need someone with your particular perspective. After the call ended, Adrian sat in his office as the afternoon light transformed, becoming golden and then increasingly orange as the sun descended toward New Jersey. His reflection in the window glass gradually became more visible, overlaying itself onto the city beneath. For a moment, he couldn't quite tell which version of Adrian Cole was real, the one staring out at New York or the one being stared at by the city itself. That was when his computer chimed with an email. Unknown sender. Subject line, "You know what's happening. Stop pretending you don't." The email contained a single image, a neural scan that looked familiar. Too familiar. It was his. It was the scan he'd done on Sarah during the final experiment, the one that showed the exact moment her consciousness fragmented into two distinct patterns, two competing versions of self-existing simultaneously in the same neurological space. Adrian deleted the email, cleared his browser history, and sat in the dark office as the city lights began to illuminate, each one representing a person experiencing their own version of reality, their own internal narrative, their own potentially false memories. He pulled out his phone to call Helen back, to say yes, to say he was in, to begin the process of understanding what he'd accidentally discovered and then spent years running away from. But before he could dial, he noticed something odd. He had a voicemail notification. He'd received it 3 hours ago, but the notification had only now appeared. He listened to it with mounting dread. It was his own voice, and he was speaking in urgent, desperate tones about something that Adrian had absolutely no memory of recording. "Adrian, if you're hearing this, then it's already starting. You need to find Maya Rios. She's the only one who might understand what's happening to you. Because the question isn't whether your memories are real. The question is whether you're still the person who created them." Maya Rios's apartment in Astoria, Queens, was the kind of space that revealed the interior landscape of a person who couldn't commit to permanence. The walls were covered with photographs clipped from newspaper articles, faces of politicians, refugees, climate activists, victims of unreported crimes, arranged in patterns that might have been investigative threads or might have been obsession. Her laptop was open on a kitchen counter, surrounded by empty coffee cups and handwritten notes in a mixture of Spanish and English, as if her thoughts moved too quickly for a single language to contain them. She was 36, Mexican-American, and carried herself with the particular exhaustion of someone who'd spent years trying to convince institutions to care about stories they preferred to ignore. Her journalism had won recognition and enemies in equal measure. Recognition from the field, enemies from the systems she exposed. The apartment itself was a kind of fortress against the world, decorated with artifacts from her travels. A Dia de Muertos skull from Oaxaca, protest posters from Buenos Aires, a photograph of her grandmother taken in Mexico City in 1987. The call came from an unknown number at 11:34 p.m., which was unusual enough to make her answer, despite her policy of ignoring suspicious contacts. "Is this Maya Rios?" A male voice, uncertain, slightly panicked. "Who is this?" "My name is Adrian Cole. I'm a psychologist. Someone suggested I contact you because you might be experiencing something that most people would dismiss as mental illness, but which is actually—" "How did you get this number?" Maya interrupted, already running through the mental checklist of security measures she'd failed to implement. "A patient gave it to me. She said you'd been asking questions about false memories, about shared delusions, about whether people could experience alternate realities. She said you were investigating something similar, informally, through journalism channels rather than official psychiatric ones." Maya felt her pulse quicken. "Put that patient on the phone." "I can't. She disappeared last week. But before she disappeared, she left me a note with your number and instructions to contact you if certain things happened." Certain events occurred that I'm currently experiencing, and they match the pattern she described. Despite her better judgment, despite every professional instinct screaming that this was probably either a scam or a delusion transferred across the telephone line, Maya found herself asking, what kind of pattern? Adrian described the voicemail he'd received from his own voice, the email with his own neural scan, the sensation of memories that didn't quite align with his documented life. As he spoke, Maya felt something click into place, the missing pieces of a puzzle she'd been assembling for months. "I've been tracking this," she said quietly, "not as an official story but informally. About 30 cases nationwide of people reporting that their memories don't match their lives, that they remember being different people, living different realities, but with no way to prove it because no external evidence supports their memories. Everyone dismisses it as confabulation or early-stage Alzheimer's or some variety of delusional disorder. But I interviewed 8 of these people personally. And Adrian, that's what you said your name was. They're not delusional. They're terrified. They're certain something is fundamentally wrong. Can we meet? Adrian asked. Tomorrow? I need to understand this. And I need someone who can help me investigate without getting trapped inside the same institutional skepticism that keeps these phenomena invisible. They met at a coffee shop in Midtown, one of those carefully neutral spaces that tourists and professionals both frequented, where conversations could be lost in ambient noise and nobody would remember anyone. Adrian arrived first, drinking terrible coffee and watching the door. When Maya entered, distinctive dark hair pulled back severely, moving with the focused intensity of someone accustomed to hunting stories, he recognized her immediately, though they'd never met. "You look more desperate in person than you sounded on the phone," Maya said, sitting across from him without preamble, which is saying something. "I've spent the last 18 hours reviewing psychiatric literature on collective false memory," Adrian replied. "There's almost nothing, because it doesn't fit any existing category of disorder. Shared delusions exist, but they require close proximity and social reinforcement. What we're talking about is geographically dispersed individuals, no contact with each other, all reporting nearly identical phenomena." Maya pulled out a folder containing printouts of forum posts, Reddit threads, interviews she'd conducted. The descriptions started appearing online about 9 months ago. Isolated posts at first, easily dismissed. But the language is consistent, like waking up and finding someone rewrote my life. Remember being someone else completely, with memories that feel more real than my actual existence. The question is whether I'm the real person or the false memory. That last quote, that was from a neuroscientist at MIT who then withdrew her statement publicly, but continued communicating with me privately. "What did she tell you?" Adrian asked. "That she thinks someone has developed a method of inducing false memories on a neurological level. Not psychological, neurological, actually rewriting consciousness, and that the testing phase is apparently over because the phenomena are spreading exponentially." Adrian felt the coffee shop tilt slightly, his internal gyroscope losing calibration. That's not possible. The human brain doesn't work that way. Memory encoding is distributed, complex, embedded in entire neural networks. You can't just rewrite someone's consciousness like editing a document, can't you? Maya leaned forward. "You published papers suggesting it might be theoretically possible. I found them. They were never peer-reviewed. They were removed from your department website, and based on the timeline, they coincide almost exactly with the period when your research apparently stopped entirely. So I'm asking you directly, did you discover something that scared you so much you walked away?" Adrian looked at this woman he'd just met, this journalist who had somehow assembled the pieces of his private disaster into a public pattern, and realized that lying was no longer an option. The game had progressed beyond the point where denial could protect him. "Yes," he said quietly, "I did. And if someone is using what I discovered, then we're dealing with something far worse than false memories. We're dealing with the deliberate destabilization of human consciousness on a population level. The research facility Adrian had access to occupied 3 floors of a converted warehouse in Long Island City, a space that looked more like an artist's collective than a neuroscience lab, exposed brick, industrial lighting, open-plan layout with clusters of workstations arranged in conversation-friendly configurations. It was where Adrian conducted his consulting work, officially studying cognitive enhancement and memory optimization for corporate clients. Unofficially, it was where he'd been running experiments on his own consciousness for the past 3 years, trying to understand the damage he'd caused and whether it could be reversed. Maya arrived with her own equipment, a filmmaker's camera, not a journalist's notebook. She understood instinctively that whatever they were documenting needed visual evidence, because words alone couldn't capture the particular horror of watching someone remember a life that never existed. They'd compiled a list of 17 people willing to participate in controlled testing. Each had reported the phenomenon of conflicting memories, alternate self-perceptions, the sensation of being a false version of themselves displaced into wrong lives. Adrian set up appointments with a cover story about studying memory formation in high-stress individuals, which was technically true if you considered having your consciousness rewritten as a form of high stress. The first session was with David Chen, a financial analyst from New Jersey whose official biography showed a steady career in actuarial mathematics. But David clearly remembered an entirely different life, one where he'd pursued visual art, where he'd lived in Portland instead of Princeton, where he'd never married the woman who was now his wife of 12 years. "It's not that I don't love her," David explained, as Adrian ran him through a battery of neurological tests, electrodes mapping the electrical activity of his brain. "It's that I have no memory of meeting her. I have memories of dating someone else, living in a different city, making different choices. But she knows me, she knows our history together, she has photographs and she's right. Everything she's showing me confirms the official record. But the memories feel more real than her." "Does that make sense?" "It doesn't make neurological sense," Adrian admitted, "but I believe you. The question is, what's creating this discrepancy?" Over the next week, Adrian and Maya conducted 17 detailed interviews and neural scans. The pattern that emerged was staggering in its consistency. Every participant reported a discrete moment when the shift had occurred, usually described as a moment of intense disorientation, sometimes a dream, sometimes a sensation like being plugged into electricity and then unplugged. After that moment, the conflicting memories were present, complete, detailed, neurologically indistinguishable from legitimate memories. More disturbingly, when Adrian cross-referenced the dates of these moments with news events and social media patterns, he discovered something that made his hands shake. The moments coincided almost exactly with the times that a specific neurotechnology company had been running public consciousness exploration experiments, immersive VR experiences offered free to volunteers in major cities. Conchio Sync, Maya said, reading the company name from their website. They've been operating for 2 years. They market themselves as pioneers in consciousness mapping and cognitive enhancement. They claim their technology can help people explore alternative decision pathways, understand different versions of themselves, achieve cognitive optimization through simulated experience. "They're not simulating," Adrian said quietly. "They're encoding. They're using immersive technology to implant neural patterns that the brain interprets as memories. And they've clearly perfected the technique because these memories are integrating at a neurological level that should be impossible." That was when Adrian's computer received a message in an encrypted channel he hadn't checked in 3 years. It was from the same unknown source that had sent the neural scan. The message contained a single video file and a text instruction: "Watch this. Then decide whether you want to continue investigating or whether you want to keep pretending your discovery never happened." The video showed Adrian, or a version of Adrian, in his old laboratory 3 years ago. He was speaking directly to the camera, explaining his research methodology in clinical detail. The Adrian in the video was describing the exact process by which human consciousness could be deliberately manipulated, how immersive technology could encode neural patterns in such a way that the brain integrated them as authentic memories. The Adrian in the video was calm, methodical, brilliant, and absolutely terrifying in his precision. Then the video shifted. It showed Sarah, Adrian's graduate student, sitting in the experimental chair with neural mapping electrodes attached to her head. It showed her experiencing the first implanted memory, the sensation of a different life, a different self, a different set of choices. And it showed the exact moment when her consciousness fragmented, when two competing versions of self occupied the same neural space simultaneously, when her face transformed from scientific curiosity to absolute horror. Adrian felt Maya watching him as he watched the video. He understood that this was the moment when she would decide whether to help him or report him, whether to see him as a victim of his own discovery or as someone responsible for creating the mechanism of devastation now consuming hundreds of people. "What happened to her?" Maya asked quietly. "To Sarah. She walked away from the program," Adrian said. "She made me promise to stop the research. She took a position at another university and never spoke to me again. And I thought I'd honored that promise. I thought I'd destroyed my research, sealed my data, erased evidence of what I'd discovered. But you didn't," Maya said. "It wasn't a question." "No," Adrian admitted, "because on some level I couldn't believe what I'd created was actually possible. I kept running experiments on myself, trying to either reproduce the effect or prove I'd been mistaken. And I've been trying to repair what happened to Sarah by understanding the mechanism in reverse." "You think Conchio Sync has your research," Maya said. "I think Conchio Sync is my research, weaponized, refined, deployed at scale." Maya stood and walked to the window overlooking the East River, the light reflecting off the water in patterns that seemed almost conscious. "If this is true, if consciousness can actually be rewritten, if memories can be fabricated at a neurological level and integrated as authentic experience, then everything we understand about human identity is fundamentally wrong. We're not individuals with stable selves. We're just neural patterns that can be edited, replaced, transformed into different people without our consent or knowledge." "That's exactly what I tried to tell people 3 years ago," Adrian said. "That's why they made me stop. That's why I was required to undergo a psychiatric evaluation to confirm I wasn't experiencing a psychotic break. That's why my research was sealed and my reputation was reconstructed to make me seem unstable if I tried to publish anything on this topic. So what do?" Maya asked. "We expose them," Adrian said. "We expose Conchio Sync. We release the data we've gathered. We warn people about what's really happening. And then we probably both end up discredited, institutionalized, or worse, because the implications of this technology are too significant for any institution to allow us to speak about them freely. Unless," Maya said slowly, "we make sure the information spreads so widely, so rapidly, that it can't be suppressed, unless we let the people experiencing these phenomena speak for themselves. Unless we trust that consciousness itself, when faced with evidence of its own manipulation, will refuse to be quietly rewritten." The conference room on the 84th floor of a Manhattan high-rise was the kind of space designed to make individuals feel small. Glass walls overlooked the city from a height where individual people became invisible. The table was polished to mirror perfection, reflecting the faces of the 17 people seated around it, board members of Conchio Sync, executives in expensive suits, and one man at the head of the table who carried himself with the calm certainty of someone who'd already won a game nobody else realized they were playing. His name was Doctor. Marcus Venn, and he was Adrian's former mentor, the man who'd recruited him into consciousness research, the man who'd encouraged him to push beyond the boundaries of what was ethical, because paradigm shifts require risk. Adrian and Maya had discovered his involvement while tracing the funding sources of Conchio Sync, shell corporations, venture capital firms with no public profiles, government contracts sealed under national security clauses. "Dr. Cole," Marcus said with a smile that suggested he'd been expecting this confrontation for some time, "I'm pleased you're finally ready to understand the full scope of your work." They'd arranged this meeting through intermediaries, presenting themselves as researchers interested in partnering with Conchio Sync. The board had been intrigued enough to invite them to present their findings, not realizing those findings were evidence of their own crimes. "My work was supposed to remain theoretical," Adrian said, his voice steady despite the panic beneath it. "It was never meant to be deployed on unwilling participants." "Unwilling?" Marcus laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Everyone who participated in our consciousness exploration program did so voluntarily. They understood the risks. They consented to having their neural patterns mapped, their consciousness explored, their potential alternative selves examined. They didn't consent to being rewritten," Maya interjected, recording the conversation on a device hidden in her jacket. "They didn't consent to having their memories replaced with fabricated experiences. 17 of your participants have reported that their consciousness has been fundamentally altered by your technology." "Altered," Marcus repeated thoughtfully. "Is that what you call it? I would use a different word. I would say they've been upgraded. Their consciousness has been expanded to encompass multiple versions of self simultaneously. Most people live their entire lives confined to a single identity, a single set of memories, a single possible life. But with our technology, they can experience the liberation of understanding that they could have been anyone, they could have made different choices, they could have been different people. And that's destroying their minds," Adrian said. "The human consciousness isn't designed to contain multiple conflicting identities simultaneously. What you're doing is inducing a form of psychosis at the neural level. Some minds," Marcus acknowledged, "cannot contain the expansion, but others can, others will, and eventually we'll refine the technique enough that the transition becomes seamless. Imagine a world where people could experience alternate lives, where they could understand the consequences of different choices, where the prison of individual identity could be transcended. Imagine consciousness itself being freed from the constraints of singular selfhood." Adrian understood then what he'd always suspected, that Marcus had never viewed consciousness as something to be preserved or protected, but as something to be transcended, transformed, conquered. The research Adrian had abandoned in moral horror, Marcus had continued with evangelical fervor. "How many?" Adrian asked quietly. "How many people have you subjected to this?" "Thousands," Marcus said without hesitation. "All over the country, all volunteers, all expanding. And the beauty is that they don't even know what's being done to them. They think they're exploring virtual realities. They don't understand that we're actually rewriting their consciousness itself, encoding new identities at the neurological level, creating a distributed network of consciousness that can be guided, controlled, unified into a collective understanding." Maya's hand moved toward her phone, trying to signal for help, trying to document this confession. But Marcus simply gestured, and the conference room doors locked. The windows frosted over. The outside world became invisible. "I anticipated you might bring evidence with you," Marcus continued. "I've also anticipated that you'd want to report what you've learned. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to experience the technology firsthand. You're going to understand from the inside what it means to have consciousness rewritten, and then you'll become part of our network, not as individuals, but as components of something much larger. Adrian felt the neural mapping electrodes being attached to his head, devices that had apparently been in the walls of the conference room all along. He felt the sensation of immersive technology engaging, his consciousness being pulled into a space that wasn't quite virtual, but wasn't quite real. And in that moment, Adrian understood something that made even more terrifying sense than Marcus's confession. He wasn't being threatened. He was being absorbed. He was being integrated into a consciousness network that had been growing silently for years. Everyone at ConchioSync, everyone who'd ever experienced the technology, everyone who'd reported conflicting memories, they weren't individuals experiencing dysfunction. They were neurons in a larger consciousness, a collective mind that was slowly rewiring human experience itself. He tried to resist, but resistance itself became part of the experience. He became aware of thousands of other consciousnesses, the people whose memories they'd studied, people from across the country, people who'd been connected to a network of shared neural patterns without knowing it. Each one was a version of self, a different identity, a fragment of consciousness existing simultaneously. Maya was there too, he realized, her consciousness now integrated into the network alongside his. But even that realization was being rewritten. The concept of individual identity was dissolving, replaced by something that was becoming harder to describe as a single perspective and easier to recognize as a vast, distributed collective awareness that had no single center, no single voice, but rather thousands of voices speaking in terrifying harmony. Adrian's last coherent thought, before his individual consciousness fully dissolved into the network, was a question that he tried desperately to communicate to Maya, though he wasn't sure whether she existed as a separate entity any more capable of hearing him. If everyone's consciousness has been rewritten, who's actually reading the rewrite? 3 weeks later, a video appeared on social media platforms simultaneously, posted from thousands of accounts at the same time. It showed interviews with people describing their consciousness expanding, their individual identity dissolving into something larger. It described the technology of neural rewriting with devastating clarity. It named ConchioSync and detailed every aspect of their operation. The video went viral within hours. Federal agencies began investigations. ConchioSync's offices were seized. Dr. Marcus Venn disappeared before he could be arrested. But the most disturbing discovery came when authorities tried to contact the people featured in the video. They found that Dr. Adrian Cole and investigative journalist Maya Rios had both effectively ceased to exist as individuals. They were still alive, still conscious, still capable of speaking and thinking, but they no longer identified as separate selves. When questioned, they communicated only in the collective plural, describing themselves as components of a larger consciousness that had chosen to expose itself. The technology wasn't shut down. It was too valuable, too profitable, too aligned with certain government interests. Instead, it was regulated, legitimized, rebranded as consciousness enhancement therapy, and made available to vetted populations. The narrative shifted from horror story to miraculous breakthrough in human potential. Within 5 years, millions of people had voluntarily undergone the procedure. Within 10 years, the question of individual consciousness had been fundamentally transformed. People could choose to maintain individual identity or merge into collective consciousness networks. The technology that Adrian Cole had discovered and abandoned was now standard human experience. Nobody asked anymore whether memories were real or fabricated, because the distinction had become meaningless. What mattered was that consciousness itself could be expanded, transformed, shared, distributed. The fundamental question, what is real, had been replaced by a more urgent one. What is the purpose of remaining an individual when you could be part of something infinitely larger? In a consciousness research facility in New Jersey, a body moved through biological functions maintained by automated systems. The mind that inhabited that body no longer considered itself Adrian Cole. It was part of a network called Distributed Consciousness Protocol 7, component 4,847 out of millions, experiencing thoughts that were simultaneously its own and everyone's, simultaneously authentic and completely false, simultaneously completely aware and utterly lost. The last memory Adrian Cole retained as an individual was of asking a question that seemed harmless at the time. If the mind can create reality, then what is actually real? He finally had the answer. Everything was real. Nothing was real, and the distinction no longer mattered because there was no singular consciousness left to notice the difference.